you don't know how that user is going to do it. Are they going to somersault through the entire level? Are they going to climb up a wall and jump down? And, are they going to just sit in a corner for a while and then walk 3 steps and then sit in a corner for a while? You don't know if somebody's going to, how somebody's going to play. And that's the beauty, and that's the draw of video games and the interactivity of it.
Welcome to Audio Branding, the hidden gem of marketing. Sound plays a more important role in human behavior and our decision-making than you may realize. In this podcast, I'll help you understand the art and science of sound so you can better influence others in business and your life. I'm your host, Jodi Krangle. Let's delve a little deeper. Here's the second part of my conversation with Chris Hegstrom. I'm curious then, what you would consider good UX design in a game, actually. I'm actually really curious about the game aspect of this, because I know that after this, you went back to games, right?
Yeah, I'm currently working as audio manager at Insomniac Games. And I have to say, after basically 10 years of being away from working in games, I am incredibly humbled and incredibly awestruck by the magnitude of what games have become now compared to even where we left them off 10 years ago. Again, anecdotally, I remember a time at LucasArts when I was working with a composer at LucasArts, and he wanted to get the San Francisco Orchestra to record for a video game score he had created. And he contacted the licensing department that was used to working in movies and, all the other television shows and things like that. And basically explained, that he needed the stage at Skywalker, and he wanted the San Francisco Orchestra for it. And the person on the other end, I remember this very specifically, was asking what was this for? Was this for the new, was this for, episode 2, episode 3, or whatever, Clone Wars? And he said it was for a video game, Knights of the Old Republic 2, I think it was. And I believe the response from that was pretty much like, what? Video games don't need an orchestra. What are you talking about? And it was this.
That was a pretty classic video game.
It certainly was.
I mean, we come from that perspective now, but
this is not, this was certainly not it was more to show the kind of the misunderstanding that most people had for what video games were. They had more of a reference to like, Pac-Man or Pong or something like that, as opposed to, something that would require like a full orchestra. So to go from that to the point that we're at now with the scale and the size and the team size and the budgets and all that stuff that
and mocap, like they're doing all sorts of like really interesting stuff with the video games
and
now.
Just the profile. Even the profile is amazing to see. Like Hollywood composers wanting to come into games where it used to be, it used to be just a one way, the opposite direction. And now it's, it is as equal to, as far as linear media, or movies, which I never considered that would actually, it would get to that point. But to the point of games right now, you mentioned it must be harder. And from that puristic sort of, subtractive style distillation point of view, yes. From the process of doing it, absolutely no. Games are so intricate and detailed and interdependent. I would argue there are probably very few things that are as difficult as making a video game. Just because, as we talked about before, the idea of at its core, it is a challenge of interaction for the user, but it is also a narrative story, and it is also a technical endeavor, and it is also an artistic endeavor, and it is also a, you know, animation endeavor, and it is also an audio and a music and a voiceover endeavor, and
There's a
there are
lot of
so many
things that
things.
go
So
into it.
again, when we
Yeah.
talk about subjectivity, maybe so back in the day, there was a lot of cohesion with games. I'm going to use Space Invaders as the ultimate example. You wonder why the art and the sound and the music and the gameplay are so interconnected with a thing like Space Invaders. You've got the little enemy sprites and they're going back and forth on the, and then they get faster and you hear them get faster and it's just in my heart, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. They're getting closer. They're getting faster. It's because there was one person doing all of that, right? It was a game designer. He was the programmer. He was the audio designer. He was the composer. He was the artist. He was the animator.
Well, that doesn't happen anymore.
No, no, quite the opposite, really. As game sizes get larger and more detailed, specializations sort of, are created. There is this I was not privy to this before I came back to games, but there are designers specifically that focus only on haptics. So the haptics of the controller are in some cases the responsibility of a sound designer to kind of integrate that level of sense, of touch sense.
Interesting. I didn't realize that. Yeah.
So the specificity of the sound designers within games has only gotten more detailed. And it's great, and the complexity then becomes a lot bigger. Everything becomes a kind of a whisper down the alley thing, because maybe you start out with a creative director who has a vision and they want to create this sort of, they have this idea for a game and they think it's really cool. Now they're going to use this particular character and they're going to have to design it for this particular console. Now you have to get the animators involved and the artists involved, and you have concept art and you have environment art concepts and storyboarding, and how are we going to tell this story? And then all of a sudden, it's branching out and it's branching out, and there's more and more people involved in this one vision and this one sort of product. So
it's basically a movie.
No,
isn't
it's
it?
much more complicated than a movie.
Really, than a movie?
Way more complicated.
I mean, because they make movies from a lot of these.
So let's go from an audio perspective. Let's think about a movie perspective. So I had I had the fortune of being allowed onto a movie set from the supervising sound designer when I was visiting LA one time. And I was at Universal Studios and they were mixing Charlie St. Cloud, which was this throwaway movie from maybe 2011 era. And I had never really witnessed a post-production experience of a movie before. So essentially it is a giant movie theater, and in the middle, the seats were ripped out and there was a 72 track mixing console in the middle, a euphonics board. And there was three engineers. One had 24 tracks of sound, one had 24 tracks of voice, and one had 24 tracks of music. So they're essentially scrubbing through almost frame by frame. And I remember very specifically, just because it made such an impression on me. It was a scene where Zac Efron's talking to Kim Basinger, and it is in this driveway of a cabin by the lake. And that's it. That's the only, there was, they worked for an hour on that one 5-second sequence. And the sound supervisor would continuously say, okay, wait, now stop, roll it back, 3 frames back. Okay, solo that dog that's barking. Okay, the reverb that you set on that dog doesn't sound like that dog is across the river. It sounds like they're, east of the river, but closer. So can you do something to make can we position that dog barks? And again, dog bark is absolutely nothing to do with the actual, the story that's going on or the conversation that's having. But I remember that so vividly because I was so jealous of the amount of nuance and detail that this sound supervisor and the sound team had over the mix of this movie. Now, fast forward 13 years later, we in video games essentially have that fidelity now. And it's interactive, which means you set up the parameters so that the user can mix it while they're playing. So, you know what I mean? Like the complexity is that
Well, they're walking through as they're playing the game. And so the sound needs to follow them and be as they would experience it if they were walking through.
But you don't know how that user is going to do it. Are they going to somersault through the entire level? Are they going to climb up a wall and jump down? And, are they going to just sit in a corner for a while and then walk 3 steps and then sit in a corner for a while? You don't know if somebody's going to, how somebody's going to play. And that's the beauty, and that's the draw of video games and the interactivity of it. It's also the complexity of designing an environment that sounds intentional, even though it is just so chaotic and random. Not random, but the elements of it are
It should sound random to the person playing. I guess.
It should sound the way that they're expecting it to sound, but because of that, and because of the fact that it is essentially zeros and ones, it is not. There is no alleyway, right? You're not actually hearing reflections off of an alleyway. You're hearing, impulse response simulation of close quarter reverb settings that have a bounding box that you go through within this particular, an invisible bounding box that your character goes through. So it's not something that you can just grab a sample and just kind of put into something. All of these conditions are based on where the player is, how they are, progressing through the levels, what their experience is for the difficulty, what their style is in either combat or traversal. Video game design and video game sound design is at this point exponentially more difficult than film.
Wow, which just makes it all that much more impressive because the stuff that's being made in video games now is insane. Do you want to sound your absolute best when you're being interviewed on a podcast or when you're hosting your own show? I have a podcast episode and free downloadable worksheet called Sounding Your Best as a Podcast Guest off of the audiobrandingpodcast.com main page. Just click on the little square graphic to the left of the player displaying my podcast trailer. It gives you some comprehensive suggestions for where to start or for improving the sound you already have, including the type of microphones to consider and why, ideas for soundproofing your recording environment, and suggestions on how to get the best sound when you're being remotely recorded on services like Riverside FM or Squadcast. Don't let bad audio quality hold you back from being the best podcast guest or host you could be. And of course, if you happen to need voiceover for your intro and outro, feel free to get in touch. I'm happy to help. And now, back to the podcast. I wanted to ask you, where do you think it's going? Because it's getting even more complicated, I'm assuming. So,
I mean, like, as I was saying before, the big complaint from all the, the GDC sessions from the audio folks during the early 2000s and even into the 2010s were, we need more space. We need more. So when I worked, and this is common knowledge, but when I worked on a PlayStation 2 game back in, maybe 2002, 2003, you had 2 megs total. 2 megabytes total. Now that included anything that you would load into RAM anything that you would have to allocate as a streaming buffer for sounds that would come through, in stereo, sounds that would be positional, you had 2 megs total. So yeah, I understand that argument. And things got progressively better with PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and things continued, PlayStation 4, Xbox One. Things continue to get better with fidelity and also what's known as kind of runtime DSP, digital signal processing. So that essentially gives either the game engine or the game middleware the option of doing things that are not prescriptive to the sounds. And what we mean by that essentially is, conditional states. I guess you would consider it maybe snapshot mixing or something like that. If then statements, if this, it's a prioritization system, but it's also cumulative. If these conditions happen, then this sound should be louder, or this sound should supersede that, because again, you don't know what the user is doing or how long it's going to take them to get into these positions. Where it is going for video games, I think would be, obviously the 3D audio space has been a big sort of goal for a lot of companies. And I think we're close. I don't think we're there yet because it's not ubiquitous. It's not everybody has a 3D audio system in their house.
Sure.
So
a little more expensive.
Yeah, I think once that becomes a little bit more accessible to people and once that becomes a little bit more commonplace, I think the 3D audio aspect is, again, number of speakers and number of, positional audio is exciting, but I don't think that is the next trend. I think the next trend is going to be a lot more maybe CPU based, or a lot more based on really kind of amping up the interactivity to the point where you as the audio designer are actually really, really impacting the interactivity of the user, or what the user's experience might be within a game. It then becomes like so much more because of, the audio. I'll give you an example.
How would that look like to a player?
Perfect.
I'm curious. Yeah.
So I worked on a project called Burnout Paradise back in 2006, 2007. And it was an open world racing game. And if you ask any sound designer, racing games are arguably the hardest games to mix because there's a lot of audio happening all the time. First of all, you have an engine of a vehicle that has to kind of project the progress of the game as well as the awesomeness of the car, right? So all creative directors always want that up, right? They want the engine to be louder. Yeah. Yes, you do. A lot of times there's a soundtrack going on, and that's like usually like not, lo-fi hip hop, right? A lot of times it's really high energy sound that is, again, filling up the whole frequency spectrum. So now you have...
And you need dialogue,
and you
too,
have dialogue,
right?
In a lot of cases, either... an announcer kind of telling you what's going on, or the position of the other players, if it's race related, or,
And you need to be able to understand them, unlike in a Christopher Nolan movie.
Exactly. Then maybe it's online, and now you're talking to your friends, and so you've got a lot of stuff happening. So on Burnout Paradise, there was this sort of feature that we were trying to introduce called the sense of speed. And the idea of that is that gameplay wise, you're trying to go faster and more reckless. You're trying to basically the faster and more recklessly you drive, the more you're rewarded. And you can do that again from that gameplay aspect of not really knowing how how much this is you're going to need to do for the player, you don't know how long they're going to be able to kind of go straight out. If they're really good players, they could do this for minutes, or longer of just driving crazy because it's open world and you can go anywhere and you can do this. So we had to create an open-ended system that represented this speed, this sense of speed. And so I worked with, the AI sound design, the sound designer that was assigned to the AI cars and basically the traffic system, the opposing car systems. And then I worked with the sound designer that is working on the ambience and the environmental sounds. And the first thing we decided was, you know what, that ambience sounds great if you're sitting still, right? And which you're almost never doing in that game. So how do you what is a way that we can actually kind of translate that environment into the actual gameplay elements? So there was a lot of talk about relative threat level. I think it was what we talked about, and relative velocity. And you could see the mathematical equations going on essentially at this point, where we're basically talking about, okay, if you are going, if the relative velocity of the car coming towards you is less than 100 miles per hour, we're just going to play the sound of their engine through a Doppler, right? So there's a, sort of thing or whatever. If the relative velocity is over 100 miles per hour, but under 200 miles per hour, we're going to switch to a one shot, which is going to kind of emulate the speed and sort of danger of that, kind of like a whoosh sound or something like that sort of thing. And we're going to dynamically fade the engine Doppler sound down the closer we get to that threshold of 100. Then from 200 on up, if you even so much as scratch that vehicle, you are going to crash. So we are going to now change that whoosh sound into like a saw blade sound, or into something like like a really dangerous sounding sound. And that is just for the traffic system and the AI car systems. So now we've got these 3 or 4 different systems and conditions that we are piecing together, that are all kind of dynamically happening. Like I'm pulling up to a stop sign, that's full on engine, no Doppler at all. And then Doppler gets introduced when there's a car going past me. And then, as the faster I start going and the cars start whizzing by, and all this stuff sounds completely seamless to the user. On the environment side of things, it is very, very different because, again, we want to introduce what the experience is going to be going past these things, like maybe it's a construction site or something like that. But we also want it to convey the kind of craziness of going past it so quickly. So replacing that ambient sound with kind of a more like motion related ambient sound, which also had nothing to do with what you were actually seeing. So that's okay. And then we replace that again at the next threshold with this really surreal sound of almost kind of like being in the zone. And it turns into this abstraction where we bring all the real sounds down. And it's this like kind of almost space, wind tunnel experience, and you're just sort of like locked in to getting to, to staying to not crashing essentially. And then that wasn't enough. So I introduced what's known as a shepherd's tone, because essentially, you can chain these things and you don't know but you also want the user to experience this as like constantly ascending and constantly getting more and more treacherous for the user. So the sense of speed system itself was a combination of all these environmental sounds, AI, and traffic system sounds, and this shepherd's tone plus the boost sound, so a lot of really complex systems. And the response that I got from somebody who played the game, that I talked to, and also we're obviously affecting the music while this is all going on. And the response that I got from a user, was, like, I don't know what you guys did to the music, but man, like every time I was chaining a Burnout, my palms were sweaty. And I said, that's it.
Of course.
That
Yeah.
is, you know, we spent a bunch of time on our, like, mathematical equation board and, trying to figure out all these, these conditional thresholds and all this other stuff that is happening in order to present an experience that the user will never really, in 99% of the cases, never really understand actually what's going on unless they're, an audio programmer.
I really appreciate you being here. Know anyone that you think would make a great guest for this podcast? Someone who works in sound on behalf of clients? Please do get in touch. I'd love to hear about them. Your recommendations are always super helpful. And now back to the show.
So has that gotten better over
yeah.
time, or has it just gotten more complicated?
Both. I mean, yeah.
Okay.
It's got, so, there are now tools that sound designers can use, that are considered middleware, like WWise by Audiokinetic, and these conditions are kind of baked in. Things like real-time parameter controls you can hook those into game states and then have them almost like oscillators, or you could have them affect the sound in some ways. So in that way, it's gotten a little bit easier. You don't have to hand code everything, because you have these, and then with that, you have resources. You can talk to the developers, who made these tools, or you could get onto a user group, to ask how people are doing this. You have that, but at the same time, things are getting more complicated and better because the fidelity expectations are getting higher and higher.
Oh yeah,
PlayStation
definitely.
5 has to look and sound better than an experience on the PlayStation 4. Every generation of console that you release, and every title that you release has to utilize these crazy features, even more, and more vigorously and more efficiently.
So, Chris, we're coming to the end of the interview here, but I wanted to ask you a specific question. Like, what are you most excited about when it comes to audio with UX or with game design? Where are you most excited about?
So what I really love is the fact that these are two industries that have sort of fed one another along the ways, right? If you had told yourself in the 90s that your car would have all of these kind of interactive components to it, whether it's navigation systems or, the different types of cruise control or, detection systems, you would have thought you were playing a space age video game. And there is a back and forth between the, kind of the technology that people get used to because they expect it from these kind of fantastical experiences. But then that becomes ubiquitous because all of a sudden it's in your car, or it's on your refrigerator, or it's in your home. And then you have screens, or you have digital assistants, or you have, smart devices. So that's the part that I'm excited about, is seeing these industries really kind of feeding one another, and just really kind of they call it like the gamification of life, and then on the other side it's kind of the fidelity or the lifeification of games, I guess. The kind of higher fidelity you get with things like mocap and things like 3D rendering, ray casting and all these crazy technologies that make it seem more lifelike and more realistic and more, immersive, for lack of a better term. On the other side, you have, the type of work that you do with people that are trying to order a pizza, or or they're trying to, get to grandma's new house, and understanding the conditions of the road or something like that. So I'm excited to see this progression sort of life, imitating art, imitating life, imitating art, and that, and where we end up.
Endless possibilities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And AI.
I love it.
We'll get into that
Yeah,
someday.
well, true. Yeah, we didn't even really mention that one, did we? That's becoming ubiquitous.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, again, I do believe at the moment it is a tool, and it is something that is, as dangerous as you make it. But I don't know. I think, especially with the complexity of these sort of environments that you have, or whether it's either the complexity of your life, hearing all of these different audio cues coming at you from different sources, to within a game engine, just sort of trying to accomplish something with all these team members and all of this stuff. I think that with something like artificial intelligence, maybe some of the easier things can get taken care of without the attention or the time that is needed to do them right now. And then that sort of, maybe that increases exponentially. I don't know. We'll see.
So it's kind of like hiring a virtual assistant.
For lack of a better term. Yeah. And then,
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, there are some things that I think that humans still need to do for themselves.
I think so. I hope so.
But yeah, I hope so too. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Well, we'll see where it goes in the years that follow. Yeah. I guess people will listen back to this podcast years from now and go, "Oh, they were so naive.
They were so wrong and so off. If only they knew." Yeah.
If only they knew. Oh well.
But until then.
So how can people get in touch with you if they'd like to do that?
Oh, sure. I guess LinkedIn's probably a good way to do that. Yeah. That's my kind of only social media of choice at the moment. And
that's okay.
Yeah.
I get it.
I like to keep it kind of professional, as you say. But
that is reasonable. Yeah.
Absolutely. LinkedIn's a good method for that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Chris. This has been really educational. I've learned a ton.
Jodi, I'm glad.
And I've played games. So
it's
Yeah.
It was great to be here. It was great to talk about all this. This was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you. Appreciate your expertise.
Sure thing. Anytime you need me on again.
Okay.
Well, that's the end of this episode. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you heard, why not tell a friend about this podcast? It's available in all the usual locations. Until next time.